All right, everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. You know how we do it around here. Someone gives us some fascinating source material, and then we kind of take a deep dive into it. And today we're looking at U.S. politics, but not just, present day U.S. politics. We've got like this podcast someone sent us, and it's giving us like a snapshot of what things might look like in 2025.
Yeah, it's really interesting at how this podcast goes beyond just like, who won the 2024 election. It's like they're trying to show us, okay, so what happens next? What are the consequences of all these campaign promises once a new administration actually takes over and tries to put them into action?
Right. Right. And I think one of the things that really struck me about this 2025 podcast was how it was talking about the 2024 election. Like, it revealed some pretty deep divisions in the country.
Yeah.
Did you get that sense too?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they basically said straight up that the election was super close and that both sides felt like they had a lot at stake. So, even though there's a new president in the White House, there's still like all this tension and uncertainty about, how unified the country really is.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like winning the election was just the first hurdle. Now the real challenge is like, actually governing and bringing people together. And it seems like from what this podcast is saying, like, the economy is front and center. Like, everyone's talking about it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, they mentioned how inflation is still a big problem, even though the new administration promised to get it under control, and they're blaming it on, these global supply chain issues that are still lingering from the pandemic, and also the fact that, they passed this huge stimulus package, which some people are saying is actually making inflation worse.
Yeah, it's like they're stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? They want to stimulate the economy, but they don't want to make inflation even worse. Yeah. So what did they say about jobs in this podcast? Because I know that was a big campaign issue too.
Yeah, they painted a pretty mixed picture. I mean, on the one hand, they said that certain sectors like green energy and infrastructure are doing really well, because the new administration is investing heavily in those areas. But on the other hand, they also talked about how automation and AI are starting to displace workers in other industries. So there's a lot of anxiety about, what the future of work looks like for a lot of people.
Yeah, and then there's the whole debate about taxes, right? I mean, the podcast mentioned that the new administration wants to raise taxes on wealthy individuals and corporations to pay for all these new programs, which is obviously pretty controversial.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, they specifically talked about this idea of a wealth tax, which, has been floating around for a while, but it's never really gained much traction before. But now with this new administration that's, more progressive, it's back on the table, and it's causing a lot of debate. Like, the podcast talked about how some people think it's a great idea. It's a way to address income inequality and make sure that the wealthy are paying their fair share. But then other people are saying that it's going to stifle investment and drive businesses out of the country.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's like another one of those, damned if you do, damned if you don't situations. But let's move on to healthcare, because I know that's another issue that's been really contentious in U.S. politics for decades now, and it sounds like from this podcast, like, things haven't really calmed down much.
Nope, not at all. I mean, the podcast talked about how there's still a huge push for some kind of universal healthcare system, or at least a public option, but the private insurance industry is fighting back hard, and there's also this whole debate about prescription drug prices. The new administration wants to lower them, but the pharmaceutical companies are saying that that's going to stifle innovation.
Yeah, it's so complicated, right? Like, everyone agrees that healthcare is important, but no one can seem to agree on how to fix it. So what about immigration? I know that's another issue that's been really divisive in recent years. Did they talk about that much in the podcast?
Yeah, they did. They said that the new administration is trying to implement a new points-based system for visa applicants.
Yeah.
So basically, instead of just focusing on family reunification or asylum claims, they want to prioritize people who have certain skills or education levels that could benefit the economy.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that during the campaign. It sounds like a pretty big shift from how things have been done in the past. So what are people saying about it? Is it controversial?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, the podcast said that some people are praising it. They're saying it's about time that the U.S. adopted a more merit-based immigration system. But then other people are saying that it's discriminatory, because it's going to make it harder for people from developing countries to come to the U.S. and it's also going to make it harder for families to reunite.
Yeah, it's one of those issues where there are like really strong arguments on both sides. And it's hard to see how there could ever be like a a compromise that everyone's happy with. But let's talk about climate change, because I know that's something that you're really passionate about, and it sounds like the podcast had some pretty interesting things to say about it.
Yeah, they did. They basically argued that the U.S. is losing its global leadership position on climate change. They said that other countries are forging ahead with renewable energy and setting ambitious carbon reduction targets, while the U.S. is still kind of stuck in this political gridlock, where one party is really committed to taking action and the other party is still kind of dragging its feet.
Yeah, yeah, I can see that happening. I mean, we've seen it play out over the past few years, with the U.S. pulling out of international agreements and stuff like that. So do you think that's a trend that's going to continue, or is there any hope that the U.S. will kind of get back on track?
I mean, it's hard to say for sure, but the podcast seemed pretty pessimistic. They pointed out that even though the new administration is more committed to climate action than the previous one, they're still facing a lot of opposition in Congress and from certain industries. So it's going to be an uphill battle for sure.
And then on top of all that, domestic stuff, there's also all the foreign policy challenges that the U.S. is facing right now. Did the podcast talk much about that?
Oh, yeah. They went into quite a bit of detail about it. They talked about how China is becoming increasingly assertive on the world stage and how Russia is still trying to destabilize its neighbors and how cyber warfare is a growing threat from all sorts of actors. So it's a pretty complicated and dangerous landscape out there.
Yeah, it sounds like the new administration has its work cut out for, like, there's so much going on both domestically and internationally. So what did the podcast say about Congress? Like, is there any hope that they can actually get anything done in this kind of environment?
Well, they didn't sound too optimistic. They said that partisan divisions are deeper than ever and that special interest groups still have a lot of influence. So it's going to be really hard to pass any major legislation, especially if it's something that's even remotely controversial.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I expected to hear. But there was one thing that the podcast mentioned that I thought was really interesting, and that's the rise of these new political movements. They were talking about how social media is giving people a platform to organize and advocate for change outside of the traditional two-party system.
Yeah, that's definitely something to watch. I mean, we've already seen how these movements can have a real impact on elections and policy debates, and it seems like they're only going to get stronger in the years to come, especially as younger generations become more politically active.
Yeah, and the podcast even suggested that we might start seeing more independent candidates running for office and potentially even winning, which would really shake things up. Yeah, it's like the old rules of politics don't necessarily apply anymore.
Right, and that's what makes it so exciting to follow. It's like we're in this period of transition where anything could happen, and it's really up to us, the citizens, to decide what kind of future we want.
Well said, well said. So to wrap things up, it sounds like U.S. politics in 2025 is going to be just as messy and unpredictable as ever, maybe even more so. But the good news is that we, the people, have more power than ever to shape the outcome. So let's all stay informed and engaged and make our voices heard.
Yeah, absolutely. And if this podcast is any indication, the next few years are going to be pretty wild. So buckle up and let's see what happens.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the future of U.S. politics. We'll be back soon with more fascinating topics to explore. Until then, stay curious.